Right, good to go. So just by way of quick introduction, Gottfried, I guess Boekenhoutskloof has a moderate history. It only started in 1773, which is just yesterday, and but I guess the big hockey stick was 1993 when Mocke really got serious about regrafting vines, etc. It's also interesting. Mark Kent, the owner, for everybody to know, is one of the founding influences in the Swartland revolution. And today we're going to be tasting some Syrah from two different vintages from the Swartland. And I would often say that Swartland revolution did as much for South African wine as maybe the Margaret River Festival did for Western Australian wine back in the day. It's now a hotspot from a marketing point of view. They've done a sensational job with that. For many people, though, personally, I would probably say the most famous wine from Boekenhoutskloof is the chocolate block. It's one of those wines that people place on a list of where were you the first time you drank it kind of wines. It has that sort of reputation. I'm just going to shut the sound off on people. Just give me a sec. Yeah, that's better. So it's quite interesting that we're actually going backwards tonight and tasting your Grand Cru releases rather than the chocolate rock, which will be available in the link tonight for people who want to purchase it. What I'd like to do, Gottfried, if it's possible, is really drill down a little more seriously into the notion of terroir differences between Stellenbosch and Franschhoek. To my mind, Stellenbosch is more of an alpine climate terroir, although it's close to the ocean. Franschhoek is definitely more maritime, and that, I guess, defines to a large degree the ultimate characteristics that we're getting out of these Cabernets. But possibly I can ask you to start there. And everybody, we're going to have to be semi-serious about the lineup of wines tonight because we're tasting the two Cabernets, the 217 Cabernets, and then the 218s. And you might, Gottfried might want to swap back and forth and compare them. So over to you, Gottfried.
Right. Maybe just to catch up there where we spoke earlier about Mark Kent and the history. And I mean, while I'm talking, just guys, just start pouring the wine and sniff through them a little bit, get some idea behind it, and then I'll start talking about the Cabernets. But I think what's important is Boekenhoutskloof, even though it's a very old property, it was an old pioneer's home. It was never really run as a winery at all. It was kind of a mixed farming kind of setup. And it was only really established post-94 as what we know Boekenhoutskloof as today. And those days they started with 7 partners, and it was really a bunch of guys that kind of came together and they just wanted to start a winery. And then they employed Mark Kent, who was a young guy. He was already quite a free thinker, was very out there, and he joined the company and he started making wine only in 1996. The first vintage was an old shed. It was old 1700 shed. He had one pump because that's the only, there wasn't capital around, and he made a few thousand of bottles of wine. And today we've grown into a company that make close to 6 million bottles of wine. And so I think it's a really, really success story for South Africa. And I think what's wonderful about Boekenhoutskloof is it really represents the modern era of winemaking in the Cape. And I think that if you look at the way we make wine, the way we think, you realize very quickly it's a company that's run really by wine people that are just absolutely passionate about making wine. We're quite strict with our philosophies in terms that we tend to we're not afraid to to just experiment with a bit more the unconventional, and we don't like to do things in a very monolithic way. And if you look at the wines also, what you're going to taste tonight, and I think this is what makes it exciting. We're going to now talk a bit about the vintages, but if you look at 17 and 18, they're actually two very, very different wines. And for us, through the way we make wine, we want to express that landscape, we want to express that vintage, and we want that bit of variation. We want a bit of that uniqueness and individuality in the wines that we make. So when Boekenhoutskloof started, the first wine they made was actually Cabernet, and today we still make Cabernet from the same vineyards that we started with in 1996, was the first year there, and that was the Franschhoek Cabernet. So I think historically it's really one of our standard great Cabernets that we do. Franschhoek is a very interesting region. It really represents, I would say, less than 4% of the South African wine industry. So for those of you who've traveled to South Africa, it's a small, narrow little valley. Boekenhoutskloof, we're tucked up right in the corner of the valley. We're actually the highest rainfall property wine farm in the Western Cape. And to give you an idea, we have an average rainfall of between 1,900 milliliters to about 2,500. So it's crazy.
What's your proximity to the ocean, Gottfried? If as the crow flies, my notion in my head was it was closer to the ocean than Stellenbosch itself.
No, it's further tucked away.
Right.
It's about just less than an hour's drive.
Oh, okay.
45 minutes.
Okay.
And so, but it's really tough. So we live in an area where we kind of shaded to some part of the day. So you're either going to get more morning sun or afternoon sun. So our Cabernet vineyards tend to get less morning sun, and I tend to get a little bit more of that afternoon sun. And also because it's a valley, it heats up quite a lot in the afternoon. You must remember in South Africa, we pick at the beginning of our, or I would say the end of our summer, so late summer. So that would be, Cabernet normally would be the month of March. Mm-hmm. And where we grow vineyards, our farming years, little extreme temperatures. We have very hot afternoons, and then the heat builds up in the valley. During the night, the heat rises, and then you have this cool air coming down the mountain slopes, and then we drop the temperature again. So it's a bit like when you grow a vine and it's this on-off switch button. And that actually prolongs the process in a funny way, which is quite interesting. Viticulturally here on the farm, we've been now 11 years organic, which I think is quite fascinating. And we obviously high rainfall organic. It doesn't always make sense to a lot of people, but it does work for us. I think through this prolonged process.
Sorry, I just wanted to stop you there. So the Franschhoek vines are a higher altitude than the Stellenbosch vines. And
Franschhoek.
And the temperature differences in Franschhoek are more extreme than in Stellenbosch. Do I have that right? Okay. Now that's going to have a
100% right.
Yep. There we are.
And that is also why, we're about 350 to 380 meters above sea level here,
right,
in Franschhoek. And that is now coming to the wine itself. You'll see that the way we make Cabernet, if you guys are tasting the wines, we follow a little bit kind of, I guess you could say, kind of more the classic Bordelais type of approach towards the winemaking, where we do tend to spice our Cabernet quite a bit with new oak. Although we are quite in that way that we want the oak to really polish those Cabernets. And then when it comes to Franschhoek, it's important. We tend to have a much grippier tannin than we find in Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch is rounder, softer, sweeter tannins. You have a much grippier tannin. It's very nervous, and it kind of lifts the fruit often. We find from all our wines, our Franschhoek Cabernet is always the one that ages the best. It's the wine that really improves with time. It's one of those wines that needs a bit of time to fatten out a bit. And so, we do our standard 18 to 22 months élevage and aging.
And your oak treatment, are you
people are always surprised that we don't tend to do up to 100% oaking.
I just wanted to ask, are you taking a different oak approach between Stellenbosch and Franschhoek? Or is it pretty much the same percentage of new and used oak?
No, in Stellenbosch, we would generally do about 60% new oak, and Franschhoek up to 100%.
Okay.
So, very different. we always pick Franschhoek between a week and 2 weeks later in Stellenbosch. So normally first for the cellar of Stellenbosch. Once that is done, then we start working on the Franschhoek grapes. So it works out. So if you're in the wine business, it's an important thing because the harvest is always too short. There's always too much to do. There's never space. It's always an issue. So that is a great to be in that situation.
Yeah, you're quite lucky because a lot of winemakers I talk to, they age 10 years at every harvest, trying to get the timing right in different places at the same time, etc. So maybe, Gottfried, at this point, it would be a good idea for the guys to dive into jars 1 and 2 and look for those 2 attributes that you speak about. These are both the 17s. So jar number 2 is going to be the Franschhoek, which Gottfried is suggesting is going to be bigger and have more tannic muscle at this point, versus the Stellenbosch jar number 1, which is going to be rounder and softer and possibly a little bit more finished at an earlier stage. Would that be the right summary, Gottfried?
It is the right summary. Yeah. What you guys would find interesting is that Stellenbosch, because it's a much more maritime influence, so I can really stand in the vineyards and we look down on the ocean. The soils in Stellenbosch is more sandstone soils, what we call also coffee stone and things like that. Where Franschhoek, you have more this really decomposed granitic soils, lots of quartz, lots of feldspar in it. So it's a bright soil, if you want to put it. When in Stellenbosch, we have a deeper soil. So the soil types are also very different. I think what is interesting is when you taste the 2 17s, that you see that in Franschhoek, we have quite a high component of Cabernet Franc blended in. We often blend up to 12, 13, 14%. I think 18 was about 11%, and then on 17 we were even higher, up to nearly 14%. So legally in South Africa you can blend up to 15% of another variety as long as you don't mix origin. Origin always is 100%, but varietal mixes you can do.
So what in terms of that component? In terms of that component of the Cabernet Franc, sorry, I won't interrupt you again after this. I'm quite curious to know what characteristic of that Franc is changing the element of the Cabernet. What are you looking for when you put those 2 blends together, those 2 varietals together?
Look, I'll be honest. It's not always such a important component when the wine is still on fairly young. It becomes very important when the wine ages. Right. We found over the years that some of our best vineyards we have on the farm has actually been Cabernet Franc. We get a character of Cabernet Franc that's very different. We don't seem to get here in Franschhoek, especially on this farm. With Cabernet Franc, you tend to always go in that pepper bell kind of characteristics. Parisians can generally be quite high on Cabernet Franc. They always say you have to wait 10 years and then it kind of throws off that green cloak and then it starts to change in character. But here we don't seem to get it. Here we often get more red stone fruit, licorice type characters. And it works absolutely fantastic in our Cabernets. It kind of lifts the fruit. It brings a perfume out, which is quite for us fascinating. I think that's why people always find that our Cabernets is quite, it's a very individual style of Cabernet. It obviously screams the Boekenhoutskloof kind of story. And then where Stellenbosch, the first vintages was only 2014. It was only due to the acquisition of the property in Stellenbosch. We said, okay, well, we're now like, if you talk to a winemaker in Stellenbosch, which obviously some of you might know is our biggest wine region and very famous, he would tell you that Helderberg is a bit like Pauillac is for Bordeaux, and that is kind of how they see it. And so we thought, okay, we're making Cabernet. We love Cabernet. We're gonna shoot a bit and make Stellenbosch Cabernet. And that's what we're doing. And we followed to some extent in the first years very much the similar philosophy we were doing with Franschhoek Cabernet. And we realized, well, the Cabernet Franc blending thing is not really working for us here because being maritime, being coastal, and having a very, very mild, it's such a mild climate and growing condition. There's not big temperature variations because the moment the heat comes in summer, then you have from the false bay, you have the ocean air coming in, and it just drops it a little bit. So you don't have these spikes. And for that, our theory is that you keep much more of that pyrazine characters in Cabernet, which some of you guys might know is that bit of slightly green note that you get. And we realized that Cabernet Franc is actually just bringing more of that character out. And the next thing you know, you're going to start making Cabernets at 15.5 alcohol to not having it green. And then so in the last years, we kind of slowed down on that. We also found that oak was important, but we didn't have to tame the Stellenbosch tannins to the same extent we had to do a Franschhoek. So we kind of could ease down a little bit on the oaking. The oaking was showing very differently. And so I think if you really look at it, it's maybe even a more classic approach to making Cabernet, or some people might even call old claret, in what we're doing with Franschhoek.
With Franschhoek. That's a good segue, because Grant was asking about the alcohol content of the two. Do they vary, and to what degree?
I think they're pretty much the same. You know, I must now look on the alcohol notes, but generally they'll both always be at 14.5. We obviously try not to go to the 15%, but normally they'll be vary between 14.4 and 14.6 on both wines. It's something I have the benefit that we're working not with single vineyard Cabernets. We're working with 4 vineyards on the one, 3 vineyards on the other one. So you can always kind of work with the site components a little bit to get the blending and the balance right when we do the barrels. Barrel blendings. So I think that's an important factor. But you must keep in mind that South Africa has had the dreadful 2016 drought vintage. And in 16, we had drought, then we came into the 17 vintage, which was kind of still having the 16 problems that were still carrying over climatically, and in the vineyards where we had still that kind of drought was still showing. Everything was kind of recovering a little bit. So 17 was generally, in normal terms, it would have been a very standard vintage. To some extent could have been, and to some might say it is great, but very similar to the celebrated 2015 vintage in South Africa. And 17 was an exceptionally good vintage. But I did think that drought factor did play a role. And that obviously with drought, you all know those grain conditions creates obviously a bit more alcohol conversions. Desiccation can be a problem, factors like that. So that did play a role in the 17 vintage though.
It's interesting to highlight that, Gottfried, because for so many times I think about a vintage and I think about that year, but it's not just that year, it's the year before as well, which has such a major role to play. Because if you drill down into the harvest conditions of 17, they talk about them being a 10 out of 10 vintage. They talk about it being spectacularly even and ripening everything. But one must bear in mind that it's inheriting something from the previous vintage. It's not something that I've ever given serious consideration to. That's very, very interesting to bear in mind. So if you take 17, which I think Platter gives Stellenbosch a perfect rating for the vintage, for Stellenbosch as a vintage, how would you compare 17 and 18 in Stellenbosch?
Look, it's an interesting thing because a lot of winemakers will tell you 17 is a level above 18. Mm-hmm. For me, on a personal note, and I'm speaking on behalf of everybody here, and with Marcus, Mark also felt we were very happy with 18. We actually love 18 for the fact that it's got just wonderful fruits. The fruit purity on 18s, where 17 is about tannin. It's about those type of structures that creates the wine. But on 18, there's a fruit purity, there's a flavor that is fantastic. And I'm not always sure that everything that we did was just vintage. Obviously, when you're hitting your third year of dryness, you kind of become a little bit smarter in your approach towards viticulture and the things you do in the cellar. Yeah. But we started a project at Boekenhoutskloof. And it started January 2017, and we finished December 2007. It was a one-year project. It was we all got quite old in that 1 year, where we built an underground facility, a new underground facility from the old cellars that runs with a tunnel, which is you guys can check it on the website, which runs right with a tunnel, 75-meter tunnel into a new winery, where we built a facility purely for aging and élevage. And over there, Mocke many years ago brought the first concept into South Africa, which was they called the OXO line. Now, the OXO line was developed in Bordeaux, originally in Untitled Chapter, actually, where you put barrels, small barriques, it's a 2 to 5 liter barrel, on these little wheels, and you can turn them. And we changed the whole élevage, the whole barreling system into that. And in 2018 was actually the first vintage where we went onto the new system.
So that theory is to incorporate the juice more with the tannins and the seeds and whatever else is in the barrel. In other words, expose it more to phenolides. So does that take does that then take over a lot of the mixing of old? People used to go and stir and the barrels. Is the idea to avoid that winemaking process entirely?
We do actually both. So we do the OXO system for the fermentation of barrels, which you do mainly with the Franschhoek grapes actually. And their benefit is you actually put the whole berries inside the new barrels on wheels. Instead of pumping over and doing extractions of pigeage or whatever, you roll the barrels 3, 4, 5 times a day, and you mix the skins inside the barrel. Through this process, the temperature that goes up, you extract a lot of tannin into the wine, and then you fine it, and you polish it already through the fermentation. You get an oak integration, which is quite fascinating. But the new cellar, we actually built the whole system also for aging of the wines, where we actually the wines get flown gravity fed into the new cellars on the wheels. So we actually fill the wine into the new barrels, but then also the racking, the washing, everything's done in place. We never move those barrels until the day we take the wine out for bottlings. Then we can move the barrels for chocolate block. But the élevage benefit of this is to return the barrels so that when we do also the aging, we have special bungs, we pull a vacuum. So we age barrels very long without sulfur. We get a very different oak integration, but it's so soft on the wines. The whole process is so soft that we seem to enhance. I don't know, sometimes these little bit of details in winemaking is what makes the difference.
They can make all the difference.
I think we sometimes overthink the science a little bit and we forget all the creative stuff. But the detail, I think, is important. And I think if you taste 18 Cabernets and 17, I think stylistically there's a little change. There's something else.
Well, let's do that. Gottfried, I'm going to ask Lou.
Actually, Rob, just hold on a second. So, Rob, because you haven't got the wines in front of you, we're lucky for that. I'll just go through very quickly a couple of thoughts about them, the 217s, and then we'll move on to the 80s if you don't mind. But I don't know for everyone else who's got the benefit of the wines in front of them, but I'm just trying them here now, and you know, having had a lifetime of drinking French Cabernet, this just is a different animal, right? You can't compare it to. I'd be interested to hear what Gottfried gets comments from of people comparing, because inevitably when you've got a Cabernet, someone compares you to somewhere in Bordeaux, right? And I can't place these anywhere on the map along the Gironde. I really can't. But in terms of the style, they're both very similar in terms they've got a herbaceousness about them, and that's, you know, you're not getting that typical pencil shaving cedar thing that you're looking for in left bank Cabernet, for instance, right? And you're not getting the perfume of your right bank Cabernet Merlot blends. It's its own unique style. There's no doubt about it. In terms of tannins, the tannins are still quite aggressive, I find, in both wines. More aggressive in the 18. I think, Gottfried, you were saying that you're looking for that structure and a more tannic structure in the 18. It's still certainly there, and I think it's still integrating, and it's still got some work to do. But in terms of the 17, softer, much more approachable, very herbaceous. There's a licorice note. I don't know if anyone's getting that. I certainly am. There's an anise note to it, which is curious.
Are you picking up on the general definition that Gottfried gave us, that 17 is more about structure and 18 is more about the purity of fruit?
Well, I haven't tried the 18 yet. I'm just commenting about the 17. The
Right.
17's, the structure is beautiful.
Right.
The oak treatment is beautiful. The tannins are still quite in the Stellenbosch, much more polished, integrated, etc. In the Franschhoek, there's still work to do. It's still integrating. It's still sort of arguing with itself. But the tannins on the Franschhoek, sorry, did I say 18 before? I'm sorry. I meant the second 17. One, the number 2. The 17, the tannins are still quite pronounced and still doing not as approachable as the Stellenbosch, in my view. But I'd love to hear other people's comments on it. Sorry that I butted in, but unfortunately, Robert's in Spain and hasn't got the wines today. So,
what I guess as a next step would be to ask everyone to look at jars 1 and 3, which is the Stellenbosch 17 against the Stellenbosch 18, and see if you can pick up that difference in fruit and finish that Gottfried was talking about. And while you're having a look, I've got some questions here for you, Gottfried. Josh is asking, how would you describe the finish on 1 and 2? So the two 17s, how would you put those together and highlight how the finish of them might be different?
Maybe I must taste them and then
sounds like a perfect excuse.
You talk about both the 17s, Franschhoek and Stellenbosch.
Yes. I'm guessing, just out of my sort of memory, the Stellenbosch is going to be a rounder, more mid-palate kind of expression.
Yeah.
And the Franschhoek, especially now that I understand the Cab Franc component, will be more linear. Anyway, looking forward to hearing what you say about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, when I taste the Stellenbosch now first, which I always find I get much more on the finish, more that red stone fruit. I get more kind of that. I would say that you pick up a bit of ripeness on the finish, a bit of like a bit of how would I put it? It's like when you have a cherry note that's kind of a little bit, seems like it was a bit desiccated, when it's a bit of that bit of stewed slightly on the finish.
Kirsch.
And I think that was a bit of that, yeah. And I think that was a bit with the dryness, and then obviously I always pick up a cedary notes, and I think maybe the oak plays a role of that, but that's kind of always a character I pick up on the Cabernet, and yeah. There's something what's interesting with Stellenbosch also is that you can sometimes finish, and it's difficult to describe, but it's sometimes a bit like tomato leafiness, which is not tomato leafiness like in the side that you get when you get wines that are aged. It's just something that we find always very typical of the fruit of the Stellenbosch Cabernet.
Mm-hmm.
Rob, these 18s are totally different animal.
I'm so excited to be able to putting them side by side like that. It's brilliant.
The 18s are broader, much more fruit forward, less structure than the 17s, but also probably much more approachable at a young age. It'd be interesting to see how these things cellar actually. But it's broader, and I'd assume it must have been a hotter vintage, but the fruit's much more prevalent. But I don't know. If stylistically they're so different, people have a preference. They will definitely have a preference.
Sorry, Gottfried, just for you to finish up on that Franschhoek 17, on your
Yeah.
on
I mean, I spoke about those licorice notes, which is very typical of the Franschhoek.
Yeah.
And I think it comes through very strong again on the wine.
Definitely, definitely.
And sometimes a lot of cloves, so it likes to show more that cloving characters. And that's kind of, for me, always very typical characteristics of Franschhoek. But I think I'm glad you guys picked it up, especially that you find there's a much more fruit intensity on the 18s, which we also found, which was quite.
Yeah, right.
I see Sam's talking about, he's referencing Amaro when you were talking about the cherry note. Sam, I think that's quite a cool descriptor.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Looking at, sorry, I'm diving too deeply into this, we're taking up too much of your time, but so looking into that 18 Stellenbosch, it's something that Lou's finding is more approachable at an earlier stage. It's showing a certain brightness and freshness. Lou, are you seeing the same in the Franschhoek 18, John number 4? Luigi, Don Luigi.
Hey, what's the question?
Are you seeing a similar pattern in the Franschhoek 18, John number 4? Have you had a chance to?
Okay, listen, these 18s are very different to the 17s, full stop, right? I would not, in a blind tasting, say they're even from the same place, because
Really?
stylistically they're so different. I don't know if anyone else agrees, but this is all about fruit. These 18s are all about fruit. The characteristics, Stellenbosch versus Franschhoek, that licorice thing is there again in the Franschhoek. There's no doubt about it. It's got this anise thing, star anise thing in it that the Stellenbosch doesn't have. Again, I find the Stellenbosch softer. Yeah, Gottfried, mow me down. What I do?
No. I think it's fascinating, and I just want to catch up. That's why when I said earlier about taming tannins, that's what we have to do in Franschhoek. And what you're saying is exactly that. There's more grip, there's more nervous tannin, where in Stellenbosch it's already around the sweeter fruit notes. In Stellenbosch, always a character that I think that you'll find in all of them. Stellenbosch gives more that graphite type of flavors. So it's quite graphite-like, where we don't all necessarily pick it up on Franschhoek. And yeah, but what I also wanted to say, it was not just our interpretation of the 18 vintage, it was also, there was a winemaking influence in 18, where we shifted into the next gear with the 18 vintage. And the stuff we did in the cellar, and also what I wanted to say, we obviously in the New World, a lot of things we do, methods we use, practices. I mean, your reference generally do come out of the Old World. Some people follow a more Germanic approach, others more the French concepts and doing things like similar to the Bordelais. But I think what is fascinating about wine generally in South Africa at the moment, in the last few years. We've really created our own style. We've really expressed our own sites and our own geographic kind of diversity, which I think is absolutely fascinating to what people are doing currently. And I think with Boekenhoutskloof, and if you taste the wines, and some people always ask me how do you describe the style of what you guys are doing? And the only way I can explain to people is that sometimes, somehow, we on one foot we kind of try and kind of showcase a little bit of the power of the New World, and then the other foot is somehow the elegance of the Old. And somehow in South Africa, this is where it's a little bit different to other New World countries. We tend to bring these two together. We believe it works most of the time, but yeah.
There's a phrase that I don't know where I got it, but I use it way too much than I should, that South African wine is the old world of the new world in terms of style. And for me, that sort of puts a pin in the characteristic of South African wine. But no question, what you're doing is taking it to another level in terms of your individualism. I think it was Matthew Jukes who wrote about that Franschhoek 18 as jaw-droppingly elemental. And I think what he was saying when he was referencing that was it's the purest possible expression that he's tasted of your wines from Franschhoek. It was, I think, a really momentous critique to add. Before we move to the Swartland on its own, there's one question from Team Toby saying, will these wine, what's the wine cellaring curve on these 4 Cabernets before we look at the Syrahs?
We obviously go through a process of polishing our Cabernets. But I think if you look at the way we make the wines, winemaking approach has always been it's very natural. I mean, we follow spontaneous ferments, elevage oxygen. So we tend to follow kind of that whole approach, and I think that makes wines of longevity. And customers are always surprised because Mocke always from day one said, we're not that type of winery. We don't do certifications. We don't do this. So he doesn't want to see pH machines. So he doesn't want to see all of that stuff. We need to follow natural ways and, kind of embrace a little bit, the old traditions. He doesn't mind the new modern pump in the cellar, but, that type of thing, or fresh. But, so I think these things play a role, and I think it helps with the aging of wines. And when any customer comes to us, you'll be surprised that we often open Semillons that are from the 2005, 2004 vintages. And people are often, I think, quite surprised. People always expect when they come to South Africa that wines just don't last, and the only wines that last is the ones that were picked at 12.5% alcohol. And I don't think that's generally always the case. And like I've said, our Swartland story Syrah has been around with the company from day one, but the Swartland story is still new and to some extent fresh, even though it's been a forgotten region where there's been fantastic vineyards for many years, but it was part of the cooperative system. And then, Mark started working with the fruit firstly just on a commercial basis, and then he only moved on looking at it and planting and going through that whole process.
Was Mark's first involvement in the Swartland Porseleinberg as a vineyard? Was that his? I'm just trying to get the timeline of when he started getting involved.
So when Mark started Boekenhoutskloof, he realized in those days that, to build this company, he had to start a second label. And he started a brand called Porcupine Ridge. And Porcupine Ridge, he was obviously looking for Syrah, and you weren't finding, in those days when you were establishing a brand like that, you had to go look a bit further than just looking around Franschhoek, Stellenbosch. And he realized when he came there with these red, iron-rich soils, schist, slate, and all these options, and these old vineyards, bush vines, and things like that, that it was absolutely fascinating vineyards out there. And they were just all going into big cooperative blends, and nobody cared. The Swartland didn't exist, and that's where he started first harvesting, bringing fruit out to Franschhoek, and then later stage to Stellenbosch. And then kind of that's how the Syrah story started. And then a guy with a name you might know, even Sadi, started, his own brand called Lumella Palladius. And then through all of that, in 2010, Mark kind of developed a property called Porseleinberg today. Got a young guy in, a young Turk in those days, which was also quite a lekker oak, and it makes fantastic Karma, and winemaker as well, Kalilo, and they started developing what is today Porseleinberg. And Porseleinberg is what we are now since 2015 vintage, because obviously in 2010 they planted vineyards. There was an old vineyard that they were already making wine from. And then since 2015, that was the source of what is the fruit for Boekenhoutskloof Syrah as well, and for the chocolate.
The main reason for my asking is we had Porseleinberg a tiny amount just this year. It was 18, right, of the Porseleinberg Syrah. And I'm pretty sure that Toby bought some. I'm just looking at the rest of the people online. Carl Sheng definitely did, Kochmeng did. So in terms of looking at the 17 and 18 Syrah now from Boekenhoutskloof, try to reference the porcelain if you've tasted any of it yet from your purchases earlier this year. So Gottfried, if we now look at these two Syrahs side by side, do the vintage elements of Stellenbosch and Franschhoek play the same way in Swartland, or is it a completely different kettle of fish in terms of comparing those?
I think 18 was an interesting vintage in the sense that it was the start of the first half of the Syrah we picked was still fairly. We didn't have any heat waves. I mean, if you've ever been in the Swartland, the concept of a sunny place does not exist. You basically burn in the Swartland. It's very hot. It's very dry, and so we had the first half of the picking was quite cool, and then we started getting heat, and then it was fast and it's furious to the end. And for us in 18, you see that there's a much higher whole bunch component in the 18 Syrah than in the 17. And the reason we had a whole bunch component was quite high because it was cool conditions, there was beautiful flavors, and we really just wanted to get a bit more of that aromatics going. So the carbonic maceration was much higher. So that would have been, around 50% would have been carbonic, where if you go to the Stellenbosch, it would have been after the 2017 Syrah, it would have been like 25% roughly. And that also plays a role. But that, I mean, in France and in I guess in Australia, and so that a lot of those decisions is made on purely what the vintage is doing. And I think that did play a role. But the 17 was a very classic vintage for me for Syrah.
In comparing these two now, would it be correct to say that the 17 is more nuanced and elevated? Is it something that has a more gentle structure to it, versus the 18, which is just bigger because of that maceration component?
I mean, the 17 you see is slightly more polished. It's a bit finer. It kind of shows more that red fruit type of components, more flowers. It tends to have a bit more of that white peppery components on the palate. Where if you would move into the 18 vintage, you get more that black olives. It's darker spices coming through. You pick up a little bit of the whole bunch component, that bit of fruit sweetness that you still get from carbonic macerations. It's definitely a bit more black fruits versus more your red kind of fruit profiles, and I think that's kind of for me the difference between the two in the vintage. Just for the guys who are who bought Porseleinberg, the Boekenhoutskloof style is different for basically two reasons. Firstly, it doesn't come from the same vineyard. The vineyard for Porseleinberg, the old vineyard, the wine, physical Porseleinberg wine, comes from a very old vineyard, and out of that vineyard, they basically, through massal selection, made it one slope, so to adjoining vineyards from the old vineyard, and that very specific site gives a very specific wine, and that wine is a very non-intervention. That wine is basically 100% whole bunch, predominantly lots in concrete. Élevage is very short, so normally just up to about 12 months, just over a year. It's a very short élevage. Boekenhoutskloof, we follow a little bit more of I would say a bit more of a different approach in terms of that we do élevage in foudre, only foudre, which is this big oval batch stocking of foudres for up to 18 months, so much longer élevage, and obviously a smaller, a less whole bunch component in the wine. And I think for us it's also important that stylistically the Boekenhoutskloof Syrah should show that Boekenhoutskloof philosophy and characters, and we want Porseleinberg to really just express that site. I mean, when you visit Porseleinberg and you see the vineyard and you taste the wine, it all comes together very, very quickly.
I mean,
the
one thing that I always think about Porseleinberg versus what you guys are doing is that the intensity of flavor in Porseleinberg kind of smacks you in the front of the face when you
Yes.
first taste it, despite the fact that it's supremely approachable at a very early stage. Whereas I find yours to be more classic in style and is more evocative for me of Northern Rhone than the Porcelainberg. There's something about your form and architecture of your Syrah that is more of a classic style, and I personally lean towards the classicism of what you're doing more than Porcelainberg.
Yeah, it's a bit like comparing a Schaaf and a Jamais, you know.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Like, you got to drink it for what it is, you know.
Yes.
So,
either way, I'm delighted to drink them.
Yeah, thank you. No, and it's interesting on the properties, but I forgot to talk also about the other property called Gold Mine, which is about 50 hectares planted, which some of you guys who know South Africa, it's next to the Mulino farm, and that was planted in 2014. A lot of that vineyards are now only coming into production in the last 2 years, and that we feel will be like kind of one of our most important components for the chocolate block going forward.
Oh, that's interesting, because I noted that you used the gold mine in 17 and 18, but less in 18. You took it down to 20%. So a different style.
The reason for that is that's great that you saw that. But in 17 we had a much bigger component, obviously, and the reason why we used the 17, the Gold Mine, is that it's an old vineyard. So it's a very old vineyard on Gold Mine. It's the original vineyard that was standing there, and we used it. But then in South Africa, virus becomes more and more a problem, and we decided of all our properties, we planted virus-free material, and every year we annually actually test a lot of the vineyards. We go through and we check, and we see there's a vine that's showing individual vine showing any sign of virus, it obviously gets taken out, and then we just replant it with new material. And that old vineyard we ripped out quite a lot of the old vineyard. And then so in 2018 the component was a lot smaller, and that was the reality why we blended less in. So it was not so much a vintage thing, it was just the way it worked out.
Thank you so much. It's been so brilliant, and I'm sorry if I kept jumping in. I had a million questions to ask. I was so excited to be able to talk to you about these different sites versus different vintage. It's been a really terrific experience. Are there any other questions from anybody before we say cheers to Gottfried? Mr. Dooley. I'm trying to unmute him. Unmute. Got it.
You've caught me unawares, but but I do have one question. We're just talking about it. So in the context of South Australian Shiraz, and given my lovely wife here, who's the South Australian wine representative. So what's the special characteristics? I mean, we're having drinking this lovely wine, and it is quite different to the Shirazes that we normally get from Australia. So I just wouldn't mind, from Gottfried understanding from him anyway, in his words, what he sees special characteristics are. So yeah.
I think that's a really, really good question. And I thought about it a lot. What makes our wine so different? Because if you look at our soils and you compare it to Australia, we both work with some of the oldest soils in the world. And soil, there's a lot. Climatically, we can find similarities. Soils, we can find similarities. But I think there's one factor that people forget about South Africa is that we've been one of the oldest vine growing countries in the world, and gone through phylloxera and everything. But same as Australia, we've all grown Syrah or Shiraz in our country for a long time. Sauvignon is the same, Cinsault, some Cabernet. And I think through all of this, the clonal selection going forward from generation of farmer to generation, they mutate to some extent. They change, they become more part of the surroundings, the climate, the soils. And then I think they start showing characteristics which becomes
unique,
origin specific. Yeah. That's kind of how I look at it. And South Africa, you guys also spoke a bit about the herbaceousness of our Cabernet, you know, and so and I think that is something which is, you know, it can, some people see it as a negative, some as a positive, but it's something that I think is quite classic. And people are always surprised that we have with our Cabernets, especially upfront, quite dry, and then we have a sweet finish. And that sweetness, that sweet spot, is a very typical South African Cabernet trademark. Our Syrah people are always surprised that it shows a lot of a different type of, a lot of peppery kind of spiciness, which is quite typical of Syrah in our country. I think the concept of more black fruits in Syrah is becoming more popular now, but I think that's more winemaking, a vinification approach. But I always find that red, dried out kind of mouthfeel is very typical of what South African Syrah is about.
I like to think that the one nexus that I sometimes can find between Stellenbosch and Australian Cabernet is Margaret River. And there's a kind of mintiness or a eucalypt kind of component that comes out of Margaret River Cabernet that I sometimes find in Stellenbosch Cabernet, but not a lot. I'm constantly trying to find reference points, but it's the only one.
Not in these wines tonight, Rob.
No, not tonight.
The herbal note's different.
Yeah.
But Grant, getting back to your point about this Shiraz, in my view, the difference between what we typically see out of Barossa is you get a black pepper note.
Yeah.
These are not. These are on the white pepper spectrum. So much more reminiscent of Northern Rhone, that type of style. It's horrible to make that comparison, but to me, it's much more. It's more elevated. Not as. There's a base note there in Barossa that's not in these, so they're much more lifted, more elegant, I guess. But to me, the main difference is black pepper versus white pepper. That's what I'm getting anyway.
And I want to hear you ask that question, Lou, one more time.
Well, you know. All right, Gottfried.
I just want to one last thing, and it's always something that if you live in the Western Cape, you take it for granted, and we forget that we have something we call fynbos.
Yes.
And it's one of the most diverse non-tropical plant species in the world. And if you walk in South Africa and you smell fynbos and you all of that, and I think we are so used to it that we don't really pick it up. But I think people outside and some things you guys were saying, and I pick up, you know what, it's maybe a little bit of a description of our fynbos, our plant regions, and where we grow our vineyards.
The only way we can taste fynbos in Singapore is to taste it in gin, because there's a couple of South African gins that are floating around Singapore.
Anyway, that was just something that I thought I might just add.
Yeah, that's a terrific reference. Thank you for that.
All right. Is it time?
It's time.
All right. Gottfried, one question we ask of all our guests and winemakers is, when no one's looking and you don't care, what do you like drinking?
It's interesting. I'm obviously, because I studied in Germany, I love to drink Old Mosel. You can give me a great Mosel Riesling any day. It's really lovely. And when the age is dry out, that stays the top. Right.
It's amazing how many winemakers answer with Riesling. It's amazing.
Again.
Well, Greg, Gottfried, thanks so much for coming. Tonight
you.
is even more nostalgic. We're saying goodbye to the Doolies who have decided to go back to Melbourne. Thanks for drinking with us all the way through COVID, and I'm sure we'll catch up again soon. And thanks to everyone else for joining us. Next Thursday, we're doing a fairly serious look at Nera Davila from Morganti, from between 2004. Blank Canvas is next week from New Zealand. Which will also be a serious look at their latest releases. So looking forward to that. Thanks so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening.
Thanks, Rob.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Cheers.
Take it easy.
For Rob, these online wine tastings are
Thank you. Fantastic. Right.
So pleased.
And
All right,
thanks,
we'll see you
Lou.
all soon. Cheers. Safe travels.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Bye, Lou.
Bye.
We'll be back. We'll be back.
Guys, thank you so much.